February 14, 1929. A chill hung in the air, as if the very city of Chicago knew what was about to unfold. The wind whipped down North Clark Street, carrying with it the distant echoes of a metropolis that never truly sleeps. The year was young, barely 2 months old, but the city was already weary, its people worn thin by the relentless dance of power and violence that had become their daily rhythm. In the heart of the city, a modest garage stood, its weathered facade blending seamlessly with the surrounding buildings. It was an unassuming structure, a mere shell concealing the storm that was about to break. The garage belonged to SMC Cartage Company, a legitimate business by day, but by night, it served a darker purpose, a secret known only to a select few. Inside, the air was thick with tension. 7 men, their faces etched with a mix of fear and determination, huddled together. They were a motley crew, a collection of criminals and thugs, each with a story as sordid as the next. At their head stood George Bugs Moran, the man who had called them here, the man who had set this deadly dance in motion. Moran was a man of considerable reputation, a notorious gangster who had risen through the ranks of the criminal underworld. He was known for his cunning, his ruthlessness, and his ability to stay one step ahead of the law. But today, even Moran seemed on edge, his usually confident demeanor replaced by a palpable unease. The men waited, their breath misting in the cold air, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were here for a reason that had been whispered in hushed tones, a reason that had brought them to this garage on this fateful day. They were here to meet with a man who had promised them a way out, a way to end the seemingly endless cycle of violence that had gripped their lives. The man they were here to meet was Al Capone, the most powerful gangster in Chicago, a man who had built an empire on the backs of those who dared to defy him. Capone had offered Moran a deal, a chance to walk away from the life of crime, to leave behind the violence and the fear that had become his constant companions. But Moran had hesitated, had refused to meet with Capone face to face, had instead sent his men to do his bidding. And so, here they were, 7 men waiting for a meeting that would change their lives forever. They did not know it yet, but they were about to become a part of history, a part of a story that would be told and retold for generations to come. They were about to become a part of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But for now, they waited, their eyes scanning the garage, their ears straining for any sound that might signal the arrival of their mysterious benefactor. They did not know it yet, but their wait was about to come to an end. The storm was about to break, and there was no turning back. The silence was shattered by the distant rumble of an engine, a sound that sent a jolt through the men huddled in the garage. They exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The engine grew louder, its growl echoing off the cold, hard walls of the garage, a harbinger of the storm that was about to break. Moran, his face a mask of stoicism, nodded towards the door. "Here they come," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The men reached for their weapons, their hands steady despite the fear that gripped their hearts. They were ready, or so they thought. The car pulled up outside, its headlights casting eerie shadows on the garage door. The engine died, and for a moment, there was silence again, a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Then, the door creaked open, and the men tensed, their fingers tightening around their guns. In walked a man, his face obscured by a mask, a Tommy gun cradled in his arms. He was followed by 5 more men, each one dressed in the same manner, their faces hidden behind masks, their weapons at the ready. The men in the garage stared at them, their eyes wide with disbelief. This was not what they had expected. Moran, his voice steady despite the shock, spoke up. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his hand reaching for his own gun. But before he could draw, one of the masked men stepped forward, his Tommy gun leveled at Moran's chest. "Don't do it, Bugs," the man said, his voice muffled by the mask. "You know why we're here." Moran hesitated, his hand hovering over his gun. He knew, of course, but he had hoped, had prayed that this wasn't what it seemed. But there was no denying the truth now. This was not a meeting, not a chance at redemption. This was a trap. The man with the Tommy gun gestured towards the back of the garage, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Line up," he ordered, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. Against the wall, the men exchanged glances, their faces pale, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew what was coming, knew that there was no way out now. Slowly, they began to move, their footsteps echoing in the cold, hard garage. As they lined up, the masked men spread out, their weapons trained on the 7 men. Moran, his face a mask of defiance, stood at the head of the line, his eyes burning with hatred. He had been played, had been used as a pawn in Capone's game. And he was not going to go down without a fight. "Al Capone sent you, didn't he?" Moran spat, his voice filled with venom. "He's a coward, hiding behind masks and guns. He's not a man, he's a rat." The man with the Tommy gun chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "Capone doesn't need to hide behind anything, Moran," he said. "He's the most powerful man in Chicago. He doesn't need to prove anything to anyone." Moran sneered, his hands clenching into fists. "He's a coward," he repeated, his voice filled with hatred. "And I'm going to kill him for this." The man with the Tommy gun raised an eyebrow, a mocking gesture that was clearly visible despite the mask. "You're in no position to make threats, Moran," he said. "You're out of time, out of luck, and out of friends." Moran opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the man with the Tommy gun raised his weapon. The garage was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire, the sound of bullets tearing through flesh and bone. The men lined up against the wall crumpled to the ground, their bodies riddled with bullets, their lives snuffed out in an instant. Moran, his face a mask of shock and pain, staggered back, his hand clutching at his chest. He had been hit, had felt the searing pain of the bullets tearing through his flesh. He fell to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The man with the Tommy gun approached him, his weapon still raised, his eyes cold and unyielding. "This is for Capone, Moran," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "You should have taken his offer when you had the chance." Moran, his face pale, his breath coming in shallow gasps, looked up at the man, his eyes filled with hatred. "You'll pay for this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You'll all pay." The man with the Tommy gun smiled, a cold, cruel smile that did not reach his eyes. "I doubt that, Moran," he said, "but you won't be around to see it." And with that, he raised his weapon and fired, the sound of the gunshot echoing in the sudden silence of the garage. Moran crumpled to the ground, his body still, his eyes closed, his life snuffed out like a candle in the wind. The man with the Tommy gun looked around the garage, his eyes taking in the carnage, the bodies strewn across the cold, hard floor. He nodded, satisfied that the job was done, that the message had been sent. He turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence, the only sound in the garage the soft, steady drip of blood onto the cold, hard floor. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand on the handle, his eyes scanning the garage one last time. Then, he stepped out into the cold, hard light of day, leaving behind the carnage, leaving behind the bodies, leaving behind the echoes of the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The garage was silent now, the only sound the soft, steady drip of blood onto the cold, hard floor. The men who had been there, the men who had been a part of this deadly dance, were gone now, their lives snuffed out in an instant, their bodies left to lie in the cold, hard garage. But the story was not over yet, not by a long shot. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had sent shockwaves through the city, had set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of history. The men who had been killed were not just criminals, not just gangsters. They were symbols of a way of life, a way of doing business. And their deaths had sent a clear message, a message that would be heard loud and clear. The message was simple, really. There was a new sheriff in town, a man who would not tolerate dissent, who would not hesitate to use force to maintain his power. The message was clear, and it was written in blood, in the bodies of the 7 men who had been gunned down in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. But the story was not over yet, not by a long shot. The men who had been killed were not the only players in this deadly game, were not the only ones who had a stake in the outcome. There were others who would seek revenge, who would fight back, who would refuse to lie down and die. And so, the dance continued, the deadly dance of power and violence that had gripped the city of Chicago, that had become its daily rhythm. The St. Valentine's Day massacre was over, but the story was not. The story was far from over. And as the city braced itself for what was to come, as the echoes of the massacre faded into the cold, hard light of day, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The news of the St. Valentine's Day massacre spread like wildfire through the city of Chicago. The air was thick with tension, the streets filled with a sense of foreboding. The massacre had been a declaration of war, a brutal and bloody message that had been heard loud and clear. And now the city braced itself for the response. Al Capone sat in his office, his eyes scanning the newspaper headlines, his mind racing. He had known that this day would come, had known that his rise to power would not go unchallenged. But he had not expected this, had not expected such a brutal, such a public display of defiance. He knew that he had to respond, had to show that he would not be intimidated, that he would not back down. He picked up the phone, his fingers dialing a number that he knew by heart. "It's time," he said, his voice cold, hard. "It's time to show them that we will not be pushed around, that we will not be bullied. It's time to send a message of our own." Across town, in a small, dimly lit room, Bugs Moran sat, his eyes closed, his mind racing. He had survived the massacre, had been spared by a twist of fate, a chance encounter that had kept him from the garage that fateful day. But he knew that he was not safe, knew that his life was still in danger. He knew that Capone would not rest until he was dead, until he had been eliminated, a loose end tied up, a threat neutralized. He opened his eyes, his gaze falling on the gun that lay on the table in front of him. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the cold, hard metal, his mind made up. He would not go down without a fight, would not lie down and die. He would fight back, would take the war to Capone, would show him that he was not afraid. And so, the dance continued, the deadly dance of power and violence that had gripped the city. Capone struck first, his men moving in the night, their Tommy guns spitting fire, their bullets finding their marks. Moran's men fell, one by one, their bodies left to lie in the streets, a message written in blood, a declaration of war. Moran, however, was not among the dead. He had slipped away, had disappeared into the shadows, his whereabouts unknown. Capone's men searched for him, their eyes scanning the streets, their guns at the ready. But he was gone, vanished without a trace, a ghost in the machine, a specter that would not be laid to rest. The city was on edge, the tension palpable, the air thick with the scent of violence. The war between Capone and Moran had become a full-blown conflict, a battle for the soul of the city. The streets were filled with the sound of gunfire, the air filled with the smell of smoke and blood. The city was at war, and there was no end in sight. But even as the violence escalated, even as the body count rose, there were those who saw the writing on the wall, who knew that this could not go on forever. The St. Valentine's Day massacre had been a turning point, a moment that had changed everything. The old ways were gone, the old rules no longer applied. The city was changing, and there was nothing that could be done to stop it. Capone, for all his power, for all his wealth, for all his influence, was not untouchable. He was a target, a man marked for death, a man who would one day fall. And when he did, the city would change again, would enter a new era, an era of peace, of prosperity, of progress. But that day was still far off, still a distant dream. For now, the city was at war, and there was no end in sight. The dance continued, the deadly dance of power and violence, the dance that had begun on that cold, hard day in February, the dance that had become the rhythm of the city's heart. And as the city braced itself for what was to come, as the echoes of the massacre faded into the cold, hard light of day, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. The story was far from over. The dance would continue, the deadly dance of power and violence, the dance that had become the city's song, the city's anthem, the city's destiny. But even as the dance continued, even as the violence escalated, even as the body count rose, there was a sense of inevitability, a sense that this could not go on forever. The city was changing, was growing, was evolving. And one day, the dance would end, the music would stop, and the city would rise from the ashes, phoenix-like, reborn, renewed, ready to face the future, ready to write its own story, ready to take its place in the annals of history. And so, the story of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the story of the dance of power and violence that had gripped the city of Chicago, the story of the men who had lived and died by the sword, the story of the city that had risen from the ashes, the story of the future that had yet to be written, the story of the city that would not be broken, the story of the city that would not be silenced, the story of the city that would rise again, the story of the city that would never forget, the story of the city that would always remember, the story of the city that would one day finally be free.